There has been a lot said about the groundbreaking visuals in Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy, and after more than 20 years since the film's release, it has really become the stuff of filmmaking legend. Whether it's the ingenious, forced perspective shots, the creative use of bigatures, the early adoption of digital color grading, or the many innovations in motion capture technology, there's a lot to love and appreciate about this film's visual storytelling. Now, in this video, we're not going to talk about the production approach for these films, which is by now well documented. Instead, I want to focus on the results, the images themselves, what we see on the screen. And because this is a channel about storytelling, I want to analyze the film's cinematography through that lens. I want to identify the best shots in the film, not only on the basis of how beautiful or well composed or technically brilliant they are, but also on the basis of how those shots tell the story. How do they bring Tolkien's world to life and help the viewer to inhabit Middle-earth and to understand the motivations of its characters? So let's get into it on the art of storytelling. So I've organized my picks into 6 categories of shots based on the unique challenges of telling this particular story, which is, a sprawling epic fantasy with dozens of characters that takes place on multiple landscapes and whose mythology spans thousands of years and involves several distinct races and cultures. All of this means that The Lord of the Rings has some interesting narrative and world-building challenges that other films just don't have, so its cinematography really should be analyzed on those terms. There are so many good shots in these movies. It's like every shot is a good shot, so this was really hard to do. So let's start with geography. Most people are roughly familiar with Tolkien's map of Middle-earth, and Jackson makes sure to actually show us this map in a few key moments to help us understand the basic lay of the land. Now, for a story that is essentially about people traveling, the positions of characters relative to each other and to its many locations is especially critical. Now, a great example of this is when the Fellowship is crossing the mountain pass of Caradhras, and they encounter a storm which is revealed to be conjured by Saruman in this beautiful shot that situates the Tower of Orthanc relative to the Misty Mountains and creates a nice opportunity to bring the film's villain back into the narrative. Another example is one of the very last shots in Fellowship of the Ring. It shows Sam and Frodo venturing towards the rocky labyrinth of Emyn Muil. Behind them, we can see the dead marshes and beyond Mordor itself. Jackson often selects locations with clear geographic boundaries to help the viewer situate our characters in Middle-earth. When we rejoin Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas at the start of The Two Towers, we get this beautiful sweeping landscape shot of the plains of Rohan. Note how the camera cranes up from behind some rocks so that the plains of Rohan are revealed as a new landscape. It's an important cue to the audience that we're entering a new territory and probably a new narrative arc. And after meeting Gandalf the White in Fangorn Forest, the Fellowship returns to the plains of Rohan to meet up with Shadowfax. The location for this shot is one with a clear forest edge, again signaling to the viewer that our characters have crossed an important territorial boundary. Now, there are tons of examples of incredible shots across the trilogy that beautifully illustrate the geography of Middle-earth, but for me, the winner in this category comes at the end of The Two Towers. It's actually 2 shots stitched together. It shows Sam, Frodo, and Gollum walking in the woods towards the mountains surrounding Mordor. This transitions into an aerial shot revealing Mordor and giving the viewer the most comprehensive image of that territory so far, setting up the darker tone of the third film. The next category is scale, and one of the main themes of the story is that small people can make a big difference, so the relative sizes of people, places, and things is a key storytelling device. There are actually only a handful of shots that show all 9 members of the Fellowship in the same frame, and many of these are aerial shots in which the characters are really tiny. This shot at the Council of Elrond is the only one that really shows us all of their relative sizes, and you can see that special care went into getting their proportions right in this shot. But while I was reviewing the best shots in the film, I found a lot of them were actually about showing the scale of places. Size and scale can actually be surprisingly difficult to convey photographically without some kind of reference within the shot. These statues at the Argonath are helped by this bird's nest, for example. Another way you can do this is by moving the camera, which Peter Jackson does very skillfully to communicate a sense of space. Certainly this long take of Gandalf trapped on top of Orthanc is one of the best shots in the trilogy. The plunge down into the caves below stands out as a prime example of how Jackson helps us understand the spatial relationships between and among different people and places as the story unfolds. By the way, this shot is echoed in the extended edition of Return of the King when Saruman falls to his death. And there's a similar shot at the Tower of Cirith Ungol. Now, one of the cleverest depictions of scale has got to be this shot of the Tower of Barad-dûr. It begins as a bird's eye shot of a tower that is so tall that the viewer naturally assumes it is the highest point, but then the camera tilts up to reveal that this tower is in fact one of the smallest turrets in a much larger and much more menacing complex of towers. This shot, which appears early in the story, tells us that Mordor is much scarier than we might first think. But for me, the winner in this category has got to be from the incredible sequence of Gandalf and the Balrog falling into the chasm at Khazad-dûm. There's a lot of incredible shots to choose from here, but I've always loved this super wide shot of them reaching the underwater lake, mainly because it looks like a slow motion shot, but it actually isn't. It's just that the space they're falling into is so immense that your brain assumes the shot is slowed down. Super cool. Okay, so we've talked about space and size, but what about time? And I don't just mean the narrative time frame of the events in the story. I'm also talking about the different ages of Middle-earth, the great expanses of historical time that are so critical for understanding this story. Let's not forget that the different races of Middle-earth age in very different ways. Elrond is over 6,000 years old. Galadriel is over 8,000 years old. Even Frodo is 50, making him older than Boromir, who's only 41, so it's all a bit confusing. The passage of time can also be a tricky thing to represent visually, but filmmakers have developed a few tricks, some of which are on offer here. One way to communicate time passing is with some simple editing. The shots of Smeagol transforming into Gollum are some of the creepiest shots in the film, with each cut probably jumping around 100 years or so in his 500-year lifespan. Now note that every time Gollum ages, the image dips to black rather than just cutting in order to signal the passage of time. The prologue of the film is another scene that deals with some complex time scales. It describes the War of the Last Alliance at the end of the Second Age. When Isildur loses the ring in the river, the ring stays there for 2,500 years. But because we're watching these events in a short chronological sequence, the film needs to represent that immense passage of time visually in just a few seconds. And it does this very simply with a rather unremarkable shot of a river at dusk where the ring lay hidden. This is probably the least spectacular shot in the film, but that's what makes it special, because the idea that needs to come across here is the idea of a long forgetting. The whole point is that the most important thing in the world is lying dormant in one of the least remarkable places in Middle-earth. But personally, I have to give the trophy to this shot from the Two Towers, in which Arwen has a vision of herself mourning Aragorn's death. The shot begins with Arwen, still a relatively young elf at Aragorn's funeral. Then it transitions hundreds of years into the future, into a world of death and ruin. As the shot pulls slowly back, Arwen is revealed to be still alive and still mourning. It's a haunting portrait of grief that could stand alongside any painting of any great master. Note also the wintry tones of this shot. Middle-earth at the time of The Lord of the Rings has a sort of autumnal quality, the feeling of being in a later season, past the time of its greatest flourishing. This is beautifully communicated by the production design in Rivendell, whose elven inhabitants are preparing to leave Middle-earth forever. In this shot, autumn has long since passed. The dead leaves in this shot are more than just an accent to add a bit of movement. They're a signal to the viewer that the elves have now left Middle-earth and left Arwen behind. It's an incredible piece of visual storytelling on its own, and stands out as one of the most powerful moments in the trilogy. Now, let's look at some shots that help us to understand the nature of evil in the story. I think it's an interesting category because this film has the distinction of never really showing its primary villain except early during the prologue. This means Sauron and the evil he represents need to be communicated by other visual means. These are the Eye of Sauron and the Ring, of course, but Jackson also finds a lot of creative ways to remind the viewer of the story's antagonist. Now, I would be remiss not to mention the film's famous jump scare when Bilbo sees the ring in Rivendell. I think I literally jumped out of my seat when I saw this in theater for the first time. It's got to be one of the best jump scares in film history, and it's also a critical reminder of what Frodo is up against as his quest continues deeper into Mordor. Now, some of these shots are much more subtle. I've always loved this shot of the Black Rider overlooking the Shire. It's the very last shot of the first act of Fellowship, right after Frodo quotes Bilbo's line about, getting swept up on an adventure. But instead of ending the first act on that optimistic note, Jackson instead uses it as an opportunity to remind us that evil is lurking just around the corner. I love how the Shire is shrouded in an ominous mist as the Black Rider surveys the landscape. But I'll give the trophy in this category to the obvious winner, the shot of the Balrog, leaping over the flames to reveal his full form to Gandalf. I love this scene so much. I actually made a whole separate video about it, so I'll just say that this shot is in part so spectacular because it's the culmination of over 40 minutes of careful foreshadowing that is a true masterclass in dramatic tension building. There's also just something so terrifying about the way the Balrog leaps into view for the full effect of the reveal. Now let's talk about character. Now, the tricky thing with Tolkien's characters is that many of them aren't quite what they appear to be. A filmgoer who has never read the books will at first see Gandalf as an old man who appears to be a friendly wizard with some magical powers. But of course, it's critical to the story that the viewer understand, at least on some level, that Gandalf is much more than that. This is done early on with the incredible shot of Bag End warping around him when he gets angry at Bilbo.
Do not take me for some conjurer of cheap tricks.
The fact that the world around him seems to creak and groan under his power suggests that he's more divine or supernatural than merely magical, which is a very important distinction for his character. And we get a similar type of characterization with this shot of Gandalf sitting quietly in Minas Tirith. This happens after Denethor sends Faramir and company out to defend Osgiliath despite certain death. The shot comes at the very end of the sequence, right after Pippin sings his song and Denethor devours his succulent cherry tomatoes. To me, this shot also says a lot about who or what Gandalf is. We often see Gandalf in a hurry, traveling across Middle-earth, trying his best to protect its people from Sauron. But here we see him alone and in silence, as innocent men are sent to their death. This moment is so much more than a beautifully lit and composed shot. It's an insight into a character whom we need to understand is something more like a god than a wizard. And though gods do sometimes intervene on some level, they cannot interfere in the battle between good and evil, which in this story must ultimately be won by men and hobbits. The longer you look at it, the more you feel like you're looking at a work by Raphael or Michelangelo, and I do think it has that much depth. But for me, the winner in this category is this shot of Gollum. This happens when Sam threatens Gollum on the stairs of Cirith Ungol, and the wedge between Sam and Frodo is just beginning to widen. This is all part of Gollum's plan, and you can really see that on his face. He's got this creepy, duplicitous smile that's just so subtle that you have to marvel at the fact that it's animated. The way he just looks at Sam is chilling, and it tells you a lot about his motivations. He knows he's not fooling Sam, so instead he's taunting him, so that Sam will get angrier and gradually lose Frodo's trust. Gollum knows he's winning, and it's important for you, the viewer, to know that as well, and this shot does that brilliantly. So for the last category, let's look at some visuals that communicate the themes of the story. Here we're looking for shots that give us a hint about what the filmmaker is trying to say more broadly. Generally, these are going to be very composed shots that could stand alone like paintings. They frame their subject in a way that a painter might frame a heroic battle, with the intent of clearly communicating which side is good and which is evil. Now, the super wide shot of Gandalf riding out to save Faramir's company is a great example. It's a very direct depiction of good versus evil, with Gandalf using divine light to repel the Nazgul and protecting the brave warriors of Gondor. But surely the shot with the most overt symbolism in the trilogy is this one of my favorite in the trilogy. It's pretty clear what Jackson's getting at here. Sam and Frodo are in the center of the frame, dangling precariously on a diagonal axis that neatly divides the landscape into a kind of heaven and hell split frame. This image asks the question, have Sam and Frodo earned their salvation? Revealed through divine light is Gandalf and the eagles who lift Sam and Frodo from the slopes of Mount Doom and carry them to safety. There's a lot to love about this shot. The fact that the frame is divided so symmetrically probably means that the filmmaker wants you to be conscious of the symbolic meaning of this image. It's a very deliberate composition. One interesting detail is that Gandalf has 3 eagles, and this can only mean one thing, that he hoped also to save Smeagol from Mount Doom. This is perfectly consistent with Gandalf's dialogue about the importance of pity with regards to Gollum.
Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life.
And is one of those little details that generally escapes the first few viewings. Along with the music, this might top my list of the most powerful shots in the trilogy. I hope you had fun watching this. If you're a fan, you're probably feeling scandalized about the many brilliant shots that I omitted, so please let me know what I missed. And please subscribe for more videos about storytelling, and I'll see you on the next one.